Hey, Mom, bring me a beer.
Huh? Mother-in-law, did you lose your hearing all of a sudden?
You can hear me, right? Hey, I told you to bring me a beer.
This is how it always goes when my son and his wife speak to me. We've been living together for 5 years, and they've never listened to me, always ignoring what I have to say. When they do speak to me, it's always just orders, like I'm some sort of maid. Jean, my daughter-in-law, speaks ill of me for everyone to hear, and Paul, my son, treats me like a housekeeper without a second thought. Ignoring them, I turn my back and pretend to watch the TV, acting as if I can't hear them. I'm at the end of my tether with these two, who only listen when they want something, but ignore me otherwise. After a while of ignoring them, Jean picks up the TV remote and shuts off the show I was watching. Startled, I looked up when she said loudly right into my ear, "Hey, mother-in-law, can you hear me? Make sure you prepare Paul's lunch tomorrow, got it?" Her voice was so loud that it made my ears ring and I involuntarily grimaced. Seeing this, my daughter-in-law laughed, saying, "Seems like you heard it," and left the living room with my son. Wouldn't she at least try to be a bit more considerate, since I am, after all, her husband's mother, and she relies on me on a daily basis? That's what I thought. But judging from my son's attitude, I'm probably nothing more than a housemaid in her eyes. In the end, there was no apology from the two of them, nor did I feel any consideration towards me. Feeling frustrated, I sent an email to my husband and decided to leave the house. My name is Karen. I will be turning 72 this year. 5 years ago, my son and his wife asked if they could live with me, because they were worried about the future and wanted to save money. Ever since then, we have been living together as two families under one roof.
If you live with us, you'll feel safer, right, Mom?
You might be right. My husband is a workaholic who started his own company when he was young and continues to work tirelessly, even at the age of 73. Because of his nature, the house felt quiet ever since our son moved out. Even when I consulted my husband about our son and his wife moving in with us, his only response was,
"Do whatever you like."
So as there wasn't much conversation and I felt a bit bored, I agreed to live together, hoping that life would become a bit more lively. When we started living together, Jean, my son's wife, and I split our housework. However, as she started saying, "My part-time job is getting busier," the workload for me gradually increased. Although she helps out when asked, she often does so reluctantly, goes out on her days off, or lazes around in her room, so I stopped asking for her help. I ended up taking on all the household tasks, and it became the norm, making me feel unappreciated. Even during meal times when the whole family is present, there is hardly any conversation. I suppose I've been numb to this, as it was the same way with my husband. One day, while I was preparing dinner for 3 as usual, I received a message from my husband saying,
"I'll be late for work. Don't eat dinner."
This was not unusual, but the problem was with my son and his wife.
"Dad's coming home late, huh? I don't eat dinner either."
"Oh, I'm going out with a friend, so I don't eat it either." "Why are you telling me this now? I've already made it," I exclaimed.
"It's fine, just leave it for tomorrow."
Despite it being dinner time, if I didn't say anything, they were about to go without a word. They could have told me if I didn't need to prepare them dinner in the first place. As long as they weren't inconvenienced, they would never even reach out to me first. I couldn't help but complain at their rudeness, but they left without a hint of remorse. What am I working so hard for? In the quiet living room, I was staring blankly at the dinner I had already prepared, which would now go to waste. What on earth am I doing? Thinking about it made me feel utterly exhausted. I covered the still warm dinner with plastic wrap, put it in the fridge, and decided to go to bed. The next morning when I came down to the living room, my husband, who had woken up earlier, apologized, saying,
"I'm sorry."
As usual, our exchange was brief. It should have ended there, but seeing the look on my face, my husband furrowed his brows slightly and asked,
Didn't Paul and his wife eat dinner?
Huh? No, they said they didn't eat dinner and went out.
I see.
I guess he saw the dinner for 3 in the fridge and asked. I was happy to have a conversation after a long time, so I told my husband about what happened last night. My reticent husband sat quietly, listening to me. After hearing me out, he gently said,
You don't have to push yourself.
He acknowledged,
Our son's attitude is getting worse day by day.
But if I don't take care of the house, nobody will, right?
That doesn't mean you have to overdo it.
His words felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I realized that I had been pushing myself, and was happy that my husband understood this. My son and his wife aren't small children anymore, so there was no need for me to work so hard. With that thought, my view of the situation seemed to brighten.
I might be late from work again, so you don't need to prepare dinner for me tonight.
Okay, I said, smiling at my husband's words. I decided to let my son and his wife understand this as well. Despite it being a Sunday, I waved goodbye to my husband and resolved to rebel against my son and his wife. After my husband left, my son and his wife finally woke up in the afternoon. Still in their pajamas, they came into the living room and immediately asked,
What's for lunch?
Why don't you eat what's left from yesterday?
But you could at least warm it up for us, or set it on the table.
You're not small children, you can do it yourself. Well, mother-in-law, you are getting old, aren't you? Jean, my daughter-in-law, joked with a laugh, which prompted Paul, my son, to join in the laughter while looking at me. I'm exhausted because Jean hasn't been helping with the housework at all. Oh, can't you manage without me? Is it your menopause or something? Jean retorted, laughing at me. I could only sigh at their attitudes. The two of them went back to their room without cleaning up after eating, seemingly unbothered. As expected, my husband didn't return until late that night. Since I didn't need to prepare dinner for my husband, I bought myself a ready-made meal from the supermarket.
Huh, Mom? What are you eating?
Ready-made food.
What about dinner?
I don't know. Mother-in-law, what are you thinking? Have you forgotten about your family? I wondered if Jean was incapable of having a conversation without throwing in some barb. I decided to ignore my daughter-in-law, which seemed to quiet Paul down. However, he quickly picked up his phone and started complaining again.
You don't work, Mom. You should at least take care of the house.
I thought that since it was their day off, they could prepare their own meals for once. As I thought this, they decided to order a delivery.
Give us the money later,
Paul said, which made me lose my patience. Since they wanted to save, I agreed to not let them pay our living expense, and I never bothered them about it. But I never imagined them to take advantage of me like this. I decided to ignore them completely, not providing any services to my son and daughter-in-law who showed such disrespect.
Hey, Mom, beer.
Oh, has mother-in-law suddenly gone deaf?
You can hear us, right? We're asking for beer,
Paul demanded, while Jean kept on making snide remarks, and Paul talked to me like I was their housemaid. Ignoring them, I turned my back and deliberately watched TV, pretending not to hear. When I didn't respond for a while, she seemed to give up and stop talking to me. But this peace was short-lived. Before I knew it, my daughter-in-law, who had come up behind me, picked up the TV remote and turned off the TV. Startled, I looked up, only for her to shout into my ear. Hey, mother-in-law, can you hear me? Make sure to prepare lunch for Paul tomorrow, okay? Her voice was so loud that it hurt my ears, making me wince involuntarily. Looking at me, my daughter-in-law laughed, saying, Looks like she heard me, and left the living room with Paul. I wondered why she didn't consider showing a bit of courtesy, given that I'm her husband's mother and she depends on me regularly. But observing Paul's attitude, it seemed like I was nothing more than a housemaid to her. As it turned out, there was no sign of consideration for me at all, and I didn't even hear an apology for last night's dinner from either of them. Sighing deeply, I sent a text to my husband and decided to leave the house. Early next morning, I packed my belongings and left the house before they woke up. When I arrived at a nearby business hotel, my phone was filled with texts from Paul, who seemed to have just woken up before heading to work. Apparently, they were in quite a chaos this morning. Texts and calls from both of them quickly filled my phone with notifications. When I opened the text, I saw nothing but complaints, such as,
"What are you doing? I told you I'll need lunch."
Jean also sent a text in a mocking tone. "Are you wandering around after forgetting your responsibilities?" It seems they had a hard time just because I didn't prepare breakfast for them, which made me laugh a little. When I saw a call from Paul, who seemed to be on his lunch break, I decided to finally talk to him.
"You finally picked up. Mom, where the hell are you and what are you doing?"
"It's none of your business, is it?"
"You didn't even prepare our food. Where are you?"
"Paul, you're not a child. You can make your own food, can't you?" I answered him with a mix of irritation. If he had struggled so much to prepare just one meal, he should have reflected a little and thanked me. But to my surprise, he came back with a word I never expected.
"I'm paying for living expenses, so I need you to do the housework."
"Living expenses? What are you talking about? I never received such a thing."
"Huh? Why not? Jean should have been giving it to you every month, so don't lie."
Paul insisted that he was paying me living expenses. I've never received anything of the sort, and when I truthfully denied it, Paul started calling me a liar. The truth is, my husband covers all of their living expenses, including their food expenses. Even after repeatedly saying this, Paul refused to believe me. I could hear Jean in the background saying, "You're probably just playing dumb and spending it for yourself." Unable to continue the conversation, I cut them off and said, "I don't know what I don't know, and I don't plan to come home for a while."
"Why not? What are we supposed to do for food?"
"Figure it out yourselves. Bye now." I hung up the phone and let out another big sigh. Why do they believe they're not in the wrong, even after all this? I didn't understand what Paul was talking about earlier when he mentioned about our living expenses. The situation improved about a week after I left the house. My husband, who had come to check on me, apparently talked to Paul and Jean, and their text suddenly became more respectful and submissive. Wondering what had happened, I received a text from my husband.
"Paul and Jean want to apologize. If you feel like it, please come home."
Thanks to my husband's talk, they finally seemed to understand. I replied to my husband's text, made preparations, and decided to go home that day. When I returned home, Paul and Jean were waiting at the entrance, their faces pale and worn out. It seems that they were quite upset by the lecture from my husband. I decided to hear the story about this past week from them and my husband.
"About the living expenses I mentioned on the phone."
"I said I didn't receive them, right? You said you wanted to save money, so I didn't say anything."
"Actually, Dad was really mad at us about that."
It seems that my son had told his father about his contribution to the household expenses. It appeared that he believed I had been lying, and throughout he seemed to have painted me as the villain when speaking with his father. However, when his father explained that there was no way I could be splurging, as I was busy from morning to night with cleaning, shopping, preparing meals for 3 people, and doing the laundry while showing him our household book, he quieted down. "You couldn't even believe me?"
"But Jean kept saying that she was giving you the money."
"So what happened to your living expenses?" "I was using them." From my son's perspective, he was definitely paying the money, so he must have been baffled that the money was not reaching me. It seems that my husband and son confronted Jean and made her confess. At first, Jean was playing dumb, but when my husband started yelling at her, she finally confessed everything. I was shocked to hear this, as I had never seen my husband yell before. Apparently, Jean had been spending the money on dining out and going out with her colleagues from her part-time job. She had been going to fancy restaurants to show off and pocketing any leftover money for herself, she explained in a feeble voice. I'm appalled. She was accusing me of squandering money on the phone, but it turns out she was just talking about herself. But living with my in-laws can be stifling, and everyone was inviting me, so I just...
Just because of that, You thought it was okay to embezzle our living expenses. You made me look like a fool too.
What? You are acting all high and mighty too. At the point when the two of them began to stray from the topic and argue, my husband cleared his throat loudly. The two of them, seemingly terrified of my husband, jumped up in surprise and immediately became silent. I couldn't help but laugh at their behavior, like children who had been caught doing mischief.
Excuses, excuses. Cut the crap. First, you should sincerely apologize to your mom. Dad, I was also deceived by Jean. So, does that excuse your attitude towards your mother? Neither of you has apologized to her since she returned. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Finally, the two of them bowed their heads to me. Still, my son was making excuses, saying that he had been taking it easy because it was his home.
I've been getting busy at work, and I just wanted to relax at home. So what about your mother, who is being taken for granted and mocked by her big son and his wife even at her own home?
My husband's words cut through my son's excuses, leaving him speechless. I'm appalled at my son, who despite his age, still relies on his parents, and at Jean, who took advantage of that to embezzle money.
Mom, I'm sorry. You see, I'm apologizing to you.
Do you think an apology makes everything okay? Please reflect on yourself a bit. The two of them thought that bowing their heads to me would resolve everything smoothly, and they were flustered by my words and tried to make excuses. But I could see through their scheme, and I shook my head. Whether you contribute to the living expenses or not, I can't overlook that attitude. You have to learn to be more grateful. But aren't you worried about your future too, mother-in-law? Yes, I'm full of worries about relying on people like you.
How can you talk to us like that?
You splurged our living expense out of stress from living with us. I can't have someone like you stay with us any longer. The two of them finally quieted down, realizing that I was not willing to listen anymore. They need to learn once again how rude their actions were while living together as a couple. Later, we managed to have them move out. In the days that followed, Jean, my son's wife, started to come to our house occasionally to learn household chores from me. She continually vented about how my son Paul did not lift a finger to help with any housework. As she had always been showing off to her colleagues, I assumed she couldn't complain to anyone else now. I now understand just how much I relied on you, Karen. Indeed. And yet, you had the audacity to accuse me of being deaf and squandering money. Being no longer able to live with us and having lost the pocket money she freely used before, plus having her part-time wages limited to make up for the money she previously misused, Jean fervently complained about her now austere life. But however I listened, all I could think was that she was just reaping what she had sown. As for Paul, he started to bring home delicious snacks as gifts from time to time, as if making up for his previous lack of consideration, which he still mentioned occasionally. I've always known he wasn't the most articulate and was primarily focused on work. Nevertheless, I was touched by the fact that he recognized my hard work during our discussions with Paul and Jean. Thanks for your hard work, honey. I appreciate it. I'm glad that I can talk to my husband like this again. I deeply feel the truth in the saying, after a storm comes a calm. Regardless of how it started, I'm now leading a life that is calmer and happier than before.
My name is Emily, and I'm 29 years old. I've been married to my husband for 2 years, and I've recently become a full-time homemaker after experiencing childbirth for the first time. Despite the struggles I faced due to postpartum, the cuteness of my angelic son makes all my fatigue vanish. I can't help but gush. He has pure, adorable eyes. I bet he'll grow up to be a handsome boy. I'm already head over heels as a proud mother. However, despite my happiness, I have a problem. It's the presence of my mother-in-law, who visits us almost daily. My in-laws live about a 30-minute walk away. My mother-in-law started coming over to support me postpartum as a substitute for my busy husband and my parents who live far away. Although her help would normally be appreciated, she does little to actually assist me. Instead, she just lounges on the sofa, watching her Korean soap opera DVDs that she brings along. She's more of a burden than a help, expecting me to serve her tea and fetch her tissues. She was the one who offered to help, but what is she here for exactly? I have tried telling her, "I'm fine, you can go home," but I ended up getting an earful from my husband later that night. Undoubtedly, my mother-in-law complained to him about being sent away. Even though I asked him to stop because our son was crying, my husband still snapped at me. He is a real mama's boy. I wish I could go back in time and punch my past self for not noticing this before we got married. He insists that I replicate his mother's recipes and even tries to make me dress more like her. No matter what I say, my husband worships his mother as if she's a goddess. However, I continued to discuss the matter with my husband. "We don't need to rely on your mom. It would help so much if you could just help me out a little." "What? I work all day and I'm exhausted. Besides, I bet the baby is happier when you take care of him." Even when I'm talking to him, his eyes are always glued to the TV or his phone, showing no sign of being engaged in the conversation. Does he not care about our son? I'm just as exhausted as he is. With my eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, fatigue, and stress, I glare at him. "Don't you dare complain to my dad. He's also busy and won't tolerate any unnecessary drama." For a moment, he turned his gaze to me, and my husband spoke as if to warn me. My father-in-law is nearing retirement, but still works a lot. I know he is busy. However, it would be a great comfort if he, who treats me like his daughter, could say something to my husband or mother-in-law. As I recall my conversations with my husband, my mother-in-law's inconsiderate voice snaps me back to reality. "Emily, the baby is fussing. Hurry up and soothe him down. It's the fun part of the drama now," she calls, not taking her eyes off of the TV screen. I stop folding the laundry to attend to my son. As I pass the back of my engrossed mother-in-law, I stick my tongue out at her in my mind. Being worn out from children and sleep deprivation, her presence, doing nothing but hanging around, has become a major source of stress for me. However, it has nothing to do with my son. If my husband is not willing to help, then I am the only one left for my son. "Well, I should get going," she finally says when the clock strikes 5. She quickly gets up from the sofa, uses my dressing table as if it's her own, fixes her makeup perfectly, and goes out into the twilight city. Apparently, she is taking dance classes for her health and to maintain her beauty. From the time we met to discuss our wedding, she would brag, saying, "I used to be a model, so it's a habit for me to stay presentable. Thanks to that, people always think I'm younger than I actually am. It's a pain." She is 58, but admittedly, she does look younger than her age. That being said, If she's going to classes this late, she should just go during the day, instead of wasting time at my house. Grandma doesn't do anything, does she? As I spoke to my son in my arms, he was soundly asleep, gently breathing. An hour later, the doorbell rang. It was my father-in-law. Having been thoroughly tired of my mother-in-law's behavior for days on end, I ignored my husband's advice and had been secretly discussing the matter with my father-in-law over the phone. My father-in-law wanted to see his grandson's face, so he had made time out of his busy schedule to come and visit us. Looking at my sleeping son, my father-in-law, whose expression was softer than my husband's, chuckled. He is so adorable. So, she left in the evening today for her dance class without helping out the house again today? My father-in-law sighed as he looked around the mess in my house. Guessing from his response, it seemed he just found out about his wife attending dance classes. Seeing the state of my house, he must have realized that his wife really hadn't been helping out at all. My father-in-law bowed his head and apologized to me. It's not your fault, I rushed to say, but he shook his head. My wife herself said she would support you, Emily, but this... I'll see to it that she doesn't come here from tomorrow. And I understand my son may not be much of a help, but if there's anything you need, let me know anytime. Thank you so much, I responded gratefully. It seemed that my father-in-law was also worried about my husband's lack of interest in housework and childcare. For the first time in a long time, I felt the touch of kindness, and it brought tears to my eyes. About 3 months have passed since my father-in-law started visiting us. Thanks to him, my mother-in-law had stopped coming to our house. My mood has been brighter ever since. I never knew I could feel this relieved just by her not coming. My son has even been able to hold up his hand now, and I've been able to spare a little more time for housework. Oh, it's a mess again. I sighed as I spotted the state of my half-open husband's room. Dirty shirts and socks were scattered all over the floor. I threw them in the laundry basket and decided to sweep the floor while I was at it. As I shoved the cleaning tool under the bed, I felt something was off. Did I hit something? As I maneuvered the cleaning tool, a clear file slid out with the bank book inside. Gosh, he's such a slob, I muttered. I picked up the bank book and set it on my husband's desk, and suddenly my breath hitched. I realized it was not my husband's bank book, but the one we'd set up for our son. Why was our son's bank book in my husband's room when I always kept it somewhere else? Currently, the only money in the account was the generous amount gifted from my parents and my father-in-law for the birth of our son. It was a considerable amount saved for our son's future. A sense of dread crept over me as I tentatively opened the bank book. All the money in it was withdrawn. Out of impulse, I opened my husband's desk drawer and pulled out his bank book. Even though I knew I shouldn't, I couldn't stop myself. Just as I thought, I muttered. Opening my husband's bank book, I found that the entire bonus he'd just received was withdrawn. Moreover, the remaining balance was too low. My mind went blank. Even as I heard my son crying in distance, I was too stunned to rush to him as I usually would. A few hours later, when my husband came back from work, I confronted him. He was initially angry that I had entered his room and looked through his things, but eventually confessed. I was financially helping my mother. What? Why would you need to support your mother? And I can't believe you do something like this without telling me. You even dipped into our child's savings. This is not okay. My husband angrily thumped his desk as I confronted him. Look, I only help out because my mom said she was struggling, okay? She's probably got problems we know nothing about. Besides, it's my hard-earned money. If you have so many complaints, maybe we should just get a divorce. He grumbled. Our son, who had been gently snoring in his crib, woke up and started crying. My husband argued with me and disturbed our son's sleep. I hurried over to him and lifted him up in my arms. The money you earned? The money in the account was a generous gift from our parents for our son. You can't claim it. Both your dad and my parents gifted us thinking about our son's future. Don't you feel guilty at all? And I'd appreciate if you would stop mentioning divorce so thoughtlessly, I retorted, watching our son, now cradled in my arms and calming down from his tears. My husband snorted with a look of annoyance. Then he presented a sheet of paper on the desk. It was a divorce paper, and his section was already filled out. I was shocked, and my eyes widened in surprise. I wouldn't mind getting a divorce anytime, to be honest. But you wouldn't want to be struggling financially, burdened with a newborn baby, he said, seemingly thinking this would shut me up. My feelings started to recede at my husband's childish behavior. That's when I realized something. He had never once held our son. Seeing me silent, my husband laughed, almost as if he was certain of his upper hand. So from now on, please pay the living expenses from your own pocket, he added nonchalantly, tapping my shoulder before leaving the room. As the living room door closed, I sank to the floor, exhausted. Tears naturally flowed down my cheeks. My son, nestled in my arms, stretched out his little hand to me and giggled innocently. I had made up my mind. The next day I submitted the paper he'd handed me to the city hall. Afterwards, I got on an Amtrak train. I left a note saying, I'll submit the divorce papers and will be claiming alimony and reimbursement for the money you used, along with my wedding ring. I was concerned about taking our newborn baby outside, but he seemed intrigued by the new surroundings and was fortunately in a good mood. I braced myself to take extra care of his health. I was headed to my parents' house in Michigan. I only brought essentials for our son and had a few of my valuables, so I didn't have much luggage. My parents, having been informed the previous night, were ready to welcome us. After hearing my husband and his mother's actions, they were enraged, but they smiled kindly and suggested that I help them with their family business and raise my son here. My parents ran a fruit farm. It was a tough job, but I had helped out since I was a kid and had some experience and knowledge. I began to think that it might not be so bad. The next day, while I was enjoying a rare moment of relaxation, My phone rang. It was my mother-in-law. Reluctantly, I answered the call. "Emily, what the hell is this about?" The moment I put the phone to my ear, a shrill scream pierced through. Somewhat irked, I replied, "Who are you?" "Huh?" Taken aback by my nonchalant response, my mother-in-law stuttered. Feigning recollection, I exaggeratedly said, "Oh, is it you, mother-in-law? I'd completely forgotten about you since I've already divorced your son." My somewhat light-hearted reply seemed to shake her. "Emily, do you realize what you have done? Acting so selfishly." I assumed my husband had to run to her, not expecting me to really go through with the divorce. It made sense that she was panicked enough to call. "Selfish? I think the problem lies with your son, who presented me with the signed divorce agreement as a threat. Though it worked out just fine for me," I responded calmly. She didn't seem to understand. "I'll forgive you for this. Get married to my son. He's so upset, he's crying right now." I wondered if he was still by her side. The image of my husband watching me talk on the phone with my mother-in-law, tears welling up in his eyes, sent a chill down my spine. At the same time, I was utterly speechless at his determination to somehow get his mother to intervene. Enough is enough. I don't need a mama's boy for a husband, or a mother-in-law who spends her night in male strip clubs. Huh? My mother-in-law choked on her words from the other end of the phone. "How do you know that?" It was clear she reacted to the mention of the gentleman's club. This happened last night. After my husband left the living room, I pulled out my phone. One call was to my parents to tell them I planned on divorce and coming home. The other was to my father-in-law, to whom I owe gratitude and an apology, to explain the situation. That's when my father-in-law revealed everything to me. The reason mother-in-law had been practically living at our house was to visit a male strip club that opened at 6 p.m. There were various reasons she stayed at our place during the day, the first being our house was closer to the club than hers. Plus, by spending her days at our house, she could avoid chores at her own place. She also used me and our son as excuses to get back late. All this worked in my mother-in-law's favor. Apparently, she had taken quite a fancy to one of the dancers at the club and had been spending a lot on him. It was hard to believe that my mother-in-law, who had always been a homemaker, had any money of her own. And she couldn't even drink alcohol because of her low intolerance. She had been withdrawing money from the bank account my father-in-law maintained, buying drinks for the dancers, while sipping sodas herself. My father-in-law had been suspicious of my mother-in-law after I asked about her. Despite being forbidden from coming to our house, my mother-in-law continued to find reasons to go out for a while. Realizing something was off, he followed her and discovered she had been a regular at a strip club. He was deeply shocked to find out about her escapades and the misses of his bank account. To think she'd even take money from her son and grandson. If only I'd found out sooner. I am deeply sorry, Emily. And to my grandson as well. The gravity of my father-in-law's guilt and apologies over the phone, having learned about our situation, was overwhelming. You lied to my husband for money because she didn't have enough to lavish on those entertainers, didn't you? My mother-in-law remained silent at my accusation, I could hear her husband's voice over the phone saying, "Mom, tell me that is all a lie." It seemed he had been listening after all. After a moment of silence, my mother-in-law erupted in anger. "Don't use such vulgar words like lavish. I'm just showing Chris my affection. He loves it when I visit him." Chris must be her favorite dancer's name. I sighed at my mother-in-law's pathetic outburst. The thought of my son's money being spent on her entertainment boiled my blood again. Neither my father-in-law nor I will let this slide. "You better be ready, ma'am." I ended the call and switched off my phone. A few days later, I received a call from my husband who made a sincere apology about the misuse of money and his mother's actions. Regarding the divorce papers, he admitted that it was only on his mother's insistence, saying, "If she bothers you, just show her the divorce papers. She'll stop bothering you." And he wasn't serious about it. He was deeply regretful about being fooled by his mother, who he trusted unconditionally, and eventually driving us to divorce. He seemed to have finally woken up. "I'm truly sorry. I've transferred $20,000 into your account as a token of my remorse, including the misused money and for the inconveniences caused. I hope this shows my sincerity. Let's start over and create a happy family. I need you, Emily, just as much as you need me." His words made my skin crawl. Reconciliation is not an option. I only need my son. From now on, I'll need child support. We can discuss this further with our lawyers. I knew that the $20,000 was the money my father-in-law had lent my husband. It was the money saved for his retirement, separate from the account my mother-in-law had been spending from. From now on, my husband would have to work hard to repay his father and provide child support for our son. He'd also be under his father's surveillance. My husband, who believed I would be forgiving him, was in tears and apologizing. But it was too late. I said goodbye and ended the call and promptly blocked his contact. 2 months have passed since the discussion with my husband, facilitated by our lawyers, was completed. Right now, I'm assisting at my parents' orchard, while also dedicating myself to child rearing. After my divorce from my husband, I've continued to keep in touch with my father-in-law. Sometimes he comes over to see my son. Through conversations with my father-in-law, I learned that my mother-in-law had secretly accrued debt. My father-in-law, who had secretly been preparing for divorce, showed no mercy and kicked my mother-in-law out. Now it seems my ex-husband reluctantly took in his mother, and they're living together. Both my ex-husband and his mother are forced to work to repay the debts and are living under extreme poverty. As I look into my son's innocent eyes, I'm determined to raise him so he doesn't end up like his father or my mother-in-law.